In my last video, I talked about the early years and impressive rise of Codemasters, one of the most celebrated and oldest developers in the racing game space. Codemasters defined what racing games were for a large portion of the gaming audience, especially in their native UK, and were constant innovators with their franchises TOCA and Colin McRae Rally. As the 6th-gen consoles aged, Cody started to experiment more with the formats of their initially single motorsport games, expanding to other forms of racing adjacent to the core series. And as the 6th-gen wrapped, a shift started both in who they developed their games for and in how their games were developed, now seeking to take full advantage of the upcoming 7th-generation consoles. This change in attitude and later in management would, in time, put Codemasters on a path to making some of their greatest failures, both commercially and critically, and eventually led them to being bought out by the infamous Electronic Arts. And although I do want to talk about the current state of Cody's, to see how they got to their worst, we first have to see them at their absolute best. If I was going to introduce someone to any game from this series to show what makes Codemasters games great, this is probably where I'd tell them to start. Lucky this is actually where I started in the series. Race Driver Grid was the next game from the Race Driver series after Cody's decided to drop the TOCA name completely. The new name signaled a new direction for the series, with Grid expanding the focus from your bog-standard racing into disciplines that require different skill sets, like drifting, toge, demolition derby, speed challenge, time attack, and dedicated endurance events like Le Mans, featuring a timer and distance marker instead of a lap counter. This might seem like a radical change, but the vast majority of events in the game still follow the usual race formula, with many of the disciplines from Race Driver 3 returning. Although some had to be cut either for budget or scope reasons, as they did need to make adequate room for the new classes. Unlike in Race Driver 3, each of the different race styles feels both distinct and satisfying to race in, although with one major caveat being the balance of performance. So, in classes like Pro Muscle, GT2, and LMP1, you're likely to have a much harder time if you don't pick a car best suited to the regulations. This would normally be a bit of a progression staller, but because this game definitely skews a bit on the easier side of track racers and features several distinct levels of difficulty from the menus, you can get around this without too much hassle. And speaking of the progression, this game has, in my opinion, one of the best structures in a racing game, period. You start out as a no-name driver taking whatever offers you can, which to me calls back most to TOCA World Touring cars from all the way back on the PS1. Then, after you've made both a name for yourself and earn a bit of extra cash, you can establish your own race team and buy your first car, a rusted old Boss 302 Mustang. This is basically the perfect starter car for this game, as not only is it competitive in most of the early game events, and shows you what a looser, more aggressive, but still very manageable car feels like in this game, but it also feels like the perfect car for Grid thematically. This isn't TOCA anymore. The land of British touring cars, V8 supercars, although they were planned but just got canned after release, and stock cars is far behind us. In its place is loud American muscle cars, the best of Japanese engineering, Europe's finest track conkers, and cars made for the fastest races in the world. The Mustang you start with is a loud, aggressive car for a loud and aggressive game, and that translates into almost every aspect of it, from the sound design, to the music, to the lighting and UI elements. And I emphasized the distinct regions earlier because that's what this game's progression focuses on. After you form your team, name it, make a C-list livery for it, and are now broke, you then enter into events in either the US, Europe, or Japan. Each region features events that highlight both the motorsport scene and car culture of that area, showcasing the absolute best of what they have to offer. This gives the game a similar feeling of variety to Race Driver 3 while retaining that player choice element I really liked from World and Race Driver 1, because you can also switch between any discipline in any region after every event, so you can get a taste for everything and still play what you enjoy most. After you get past the relatively short first stage, you then move on to the faster categories like Formula 3 and GT 1 and 2, as well as expanding your team. This is one of those elements that you'd go on to see a lot in series like Codemasters' own F1 games down the line, the teammate and sponsorship system. The teammate and sponsorship system is where you can really make some interesting choices about your campaign. See, after your very first race as your own boss, you'll be rewarded with sponsorship opportunities depending on how well you finished. And these sponsors can be applied to your car and will give you payouts every race you meet their goals, usually finishing well and with no damage. These can be a very easy way to make some quick money from races, especially in the very early and very late game where you're gonna need it. And starting in stage 2, you'll have enough funds to upgrade to a 2-car garage and hire a teammate. They will bring up your team average in races as well as extra sponsorship money in exchange for a portion of their own winnings and oftentimes a signing bonus. This is a really cool feature to have in a game like this and really adds to the feeling of being your own boss. Although it doesn't take long to notice that the teammate mechanic itself was a little undercooked. Not just because of how they often act in races, but because of how few teammates there actually are, and how broken the search and region functions are. Like, I swear almost every run I have of this game, I end up with a Slovakian teammate that this game swears is from Japan. Although this is still a really great feature that also changes as you progress through the game, as the further in you go, the better and more expensive the teammates you can sign. You also get to participate in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, which acts as the race season capper after every 4 race day events. If you don't have a car that can compete, you can sign with another team and race for them under a single race deal. This is also a good way to make some early game money. If you do have the funds to buy a car, you can run it under your own banner and take home an even bigger cut. Or you can just skip out if you don't want to run it right then, which I think is fair given that you are going to see it a lot throughout the career. And after a handful of seasons and championships, you should have progressed to the World Series, where you face off against the team and player you used back in Race Driver 1, Nathan McCain, and the Raven West team. I really like this touch in the sequel games, where you as the player face off against the character you were in the previous game. Tokyo Extreme Racer and Deus Ex, anyone? This all wraps up into a beautifully structured career that's engaging while also staying fresh almost the entire way through. And that's not even the only area like that, because I haven't even got to the actual gameplay yet. The way each of the classes feel, whether it's racing, drifting, or dirt showdown, is damn near perfect. The cars have a weight and looseness to them that makes them feel like something that has to be reined in and learned over time, but the insane levels of grip you have mean it's never too difficult to make the cars feel like a spaceship going through corners. That is if you have the assists on. Yeah, this is basically the one racing game, sim or arcade, where not only do I always play with at least some assists on, but I recommend you doing the same too. Because unlike a lot of other racing games that try and program things like stability control and traction control to behave realistically, Grid basically gives you a grip multiplier and says have at it. This means that in races you will be inarguably slower regardless of how fast you are with traction control off. I guess this would be a good challenge, like if the highest opponent difficulties weren't enough for you, you can add this. But it also changes the handling feel enough to where it would definitely take a race or two to get used to, so I don't know, to each his own on this. And before I forget to mention it, the vibes of this game are, yes, they're so good. Yeah, make your jokes now about the game being covered in piss. I know, it was 2008, this is just how things were. But I'd also like to argue that of the games that enjoyed the urinification effect of the late 2000s, Grid was actually one of the games to do it tastefully, at least in comparison. Like, this was actually Cody's second attempt at a pee-smeared experience. The first looked like This...
80, rest and left 6.
And, I definitely know which one I prefer visually. But it doesn't just stop at filters. This whole game has a unique and still not revisited aesthetic. The yellow glow of sun rays contrasting with the metallic surfaces and white quartz-like menu icons in front of you. I really like this whole 3D menu thing the game has going on for basically the entire game, which is something it actually shared with the 3 Colin McRae games of this era that I'll get to. I asked a 3D modeler friend of mine how long he thought it would take to do this given the time period and tools available when this game was being made, and while we obviously can't know for sure, and we also don't know how far into development this was made, which would have increased the time needed to add it in, he gave me an estimate close to a month if we include all the debugging and fixing that would need to happen after the initial art and animation. This is such an unnecessary feature, but it's also so necessary because look at how cool this is. This just flowing and very physical menu system, not to mention you can literally move the camera around to get a better look at stuff. I actually had a direct source at Cody's, that you'll meet in a moment, tell me that Cody's had something like 3 times the staff focused on art and animation in the menus and transitions versus the number of people they had working on physics. Which, given how inconsistent the physics space can be, along with tying how twitchy it is to the frame rate, and just how good all these menus look, I can actually believe that. It all just gives this game a feeling like it was made by a team putting all of their ideas forward and having the ability to craft them into a complete experience. And this even extends to the audio. I actually had an opportunity to have a conversation with the lead audio programmer for not just this game, but also Dirt 1 and 2, F1 2010, and many of the greatest works from Criterion.
Oh man, so I'm Adam, and I am often known as the Minecraft guy, but I would rather be known as the Burnout guy. 25 years in the games industry, most of it was racing games, and I say to people, I worked on the Burnout games, I worked on Colin McRae, I worked on some absolutely atrocious titles as well. I worked on some real stinkers. But I'd say I thankfully was lucky enough to work on the Burnout ones, which is, I'm so proud of that. And I mean, we were a wonderful team, we were at the right time, we had the right attitude, and nothing could ever take that away. And I will never work on a game that good, ever.
He gave me a great understanding and appreciation for the work that went into perfecting the audio in the way they had. From the car sounds, which were both fairly realistic for the time, and still enhanced for the specific tone of the game.
So I was the lead audio programmer on, I don't even know how many titles but I specialise generally in audio for car engines, car collision, car skids, impact, surface noises, all of those things. So we iterated and iterated and iterated. So we started off with a looping audio system, then we moved on to granular synthesis, and then we moved on to what's called Jinsu, which is, so Jinsu knives are knives that slice things into very thin slices. So we would slice the engine audio up into single revolutions and then to single cylinder firings, and then replay the cylinder firing recordings in a different order in order to get it back. So we really went to just incredible levels of detail in the game, which is...
This kind of work also extended to the environmental sounds. Like, you don't just get to hear the car's engine, but you hear stuff like the suspension compression. And tire skids. You also get to hear the crowds cheering as you pass on by. And the sounds of overhead commentators, which really add feeling and atmosphere to the races in lieu of music.
So we wanted to have this in the drift events, this crazy over-the-top announcer, and he would just be shouting he was going to, like Takeshi's Castle, like proper excited Japanese guy.
Yeah.
And the designers, they weren't really interested. We're like, no, we're going to do it. So we had some audio budget, so we recorded him, put him in, and they loved him. And they're like, can you just dial him up to 100, just keep making him say stuff. And we're like, yeah, but he actually says stuff based on what you do. So if you do like a 10 combo, he's actually saying, yeah, 10 combo. I don't speak Japanese. But he just doesn't shut up. He just
No, he doesn't.
And we kind of argued, all right, so maybe he's actually talking about other events. It's fine. And about 6 months after release, a very polite man comes into my office. He goes, Adam, because you're the... Yeah, can I check? I'm doing the Japanese port of Race Driver Grid, and I think there might be a bug with the commentator. I'm like, oh, no, oh, yes. And let me find the line of code that just makes it... Because if you're playing it in Japan, he sounds like he's a complete nutcase, because you can understand what he's saying. But we had one line of code to flip it back to the correct behavior, but he doesn't just interject random stuff. And that's the end of my drift story.
But that also doesn't mean this game didn't feature some amazing music from the team. In the menus, you have this really atmospheric and mellow electronic soundtrack, but it's not so chill as to take away from the game's aggression. More so, it helps add to the garage's feel as a respite from the harsh track outside. And in races, this game follows a combination of the Marty O'Donnell and Paul Linford schools of game music, in that most of the races don't actually feature music, with it appearing more often in later game races and in the Le Mans events, and also sharing in most Wanted's use of a dynamic score, as the music will change based on stuff like your position in the race, if you crashed, or if you're on the lead lap. Like Mario Kart. Like, this game is incredible, and you can feel in so much of this game just how much passion went into it. And like any great work, especially a Codemasters one, it's not a flawless stone. The aforementioned graphics and physics issues, as well as the AI, not exactly, being really dumb in spots, and in the drift events not remotely putting up a challenge. There's the car meta and weird teammate stuff, and this game was an absolute nightmare to get running on PC. Like, I shit you not, the first time I played this game on PC, I had a crash after every 2 races, and I only recently got it patched for this video. But even with its flaws, the original Grid is a fine stone that shines brighter than most of the current era and of its own era. And I absolutely recommend this game to anyone, regardless of if they like racing games or not. Because this would also be a great game to play with friends if you get your hands on an old 360 or PS3. Fast and contact heavy, but still easy enough for a new player to learn. This is often cited as the best racing game Codemasters made, and while I personally disagree with that sentiment, I'm not gonna remotely hold it against someone who thinks that, because this is great. But what happens when something great is made? A sequel! After leaving the conventions of Toka behind with the first Grid game, and being met with rapturous praise and solid sales, it was a no-brainer to continue the series with this new direction. But Codemasters wanted to come correct if they were going to continue with this new feel. So instead of releasing this game 2 years later, like they had been doing since 2002, they instead spent 5 years working on the next game. Although that's not totally right, as this game was likely in pre-production for years, and seemingly only started real development in late 2011 or early 2012, meaning it was developed in about the same amount of time as the first Grid, maybe just a little bit longer. Grid 2 was made to continue and refine on the ideas from the first, while also trying to experiment with the formula. And did it succeed? Kinda. The first thing you'll notice about this game when you boot it up is how it takes a much more modern and sleek approach to its design when compared to the first game, which I'm not against completely. I just feel that for a game with such inherent roughness and grit as the original Grid, more of it should be carried over into its sequel. Although that doesn't mean the art direction is lacking, because in races, damn does this game look great. At its best, this game looks like something that could have come out not even a year or two ago with how well certain environments stand out, and at its worst, it looks like someone took Grid 1 and said,
"Get your funky ass in that tub, bitch."
They cleared out all the piss, making the game look closer to what Grid 1 seemed like to those of us with cyan-colored nostalgia shades on. This looks amazing, and does so in the same way a lot of my favorites of that era like Need for Speed Shift 2, Hot Pursuit 2010, and Forza Horizon 1 do, by having what I call stylized realism, or the rendering of a realistic scene in an accentuated or more film-like way that adds to its visual appeal, without striving for hyper-realism. The king of this art style is still Evolution Studios' Drive Club from 2014, because it takes these modern car models and landscapes and pairs them with detailed lighting, effects, and camera movement that make them feel realer than real. This is why this art style ages better than games that aim for outright hyperrealism or trying to render a scene as realistic as possible with the technology you have. See Forza Motorsport 5, Gran Turismo 6, and Race Room. Although Race Room and other regularly updated sims from that era like Base Assetto Corsa and R-Factor 2 aren't exactly fair comparisons because those have had graphical improvements since their release, like look at iRacing. Calling that a game with graphics from 2008 is a gross stretching of the truth. But either way, I'd argue games like Drive Club and this are way more visually appealing. The next thing I noticed after the graphics was the physics. And I didn't hate it. Yes, I know, the physics were a pain point for a lot of people both then and now, and if you look at my gameplay, it looks like I'm barely in control and having to drift almost every corner just to keep the car on track. Which is partially true, but doesn't remotely tell the whole story. The handling in this game was tuned in a way that makes it feel very clean and easy through flowing medium and high speed corners, giving you the ability to tap the brake and let the car's slip angle and turning push you through the rest of the corner as you modulate steering and throttle inputs. If that sounded like a bunch of nonsense to you, what it boils down to is this game wants you to slide the rear out in corners to take them faster. Now this is not brake to drift. Brake to drift is where the brake pedal acts as a drift button, i.e. Need for Speed 2015 or Ridge Racer, and also requires you to drift to make basically every corner in the game. Grid 2 on the other hand encourages you to slide through most corners, although depending on car type, the track, or even the exact corner, you may not have to, and that's the difference. Because there were uncountable numbers of times where I drifted or at the very least power slided through corners in Grid 1 because it was what I had concluded was the best way to take the corner, it's just like that in Grid 2. That's just a more common solution to the question, how am I going to approach this turn? Now am I saying it's wrong to dislike that? No. In fact, I still prefer Grid 1's handling to this. I just don't think it's an absolute travesty like some have made it out to be. Now where I do have major issues with this game's handling is in the drifting events, which actually did feel off, especially when compared to Grid 1. I chalk this up half to the fact that they tried to keep the same handling and tuning for the cars in both race and drift events, which means that cars that are still viable in races are forced to drift in ways they are not built for. Yes, drifting a race car is very possible in real life, but is it fun and easy to do? And half is down to this game forcing you to drift on these narrow-ass tracks and mountain passes. Like, the trickiest drift events for me from the first game are these freestyle events at Tokyo Dockyard, and even these aren't that bad, and Mount Haruna feels about twice as wide as the passes in this game, so it just feels a bit off. I guess this did kind of fix the issue a lot of arcade racers with drifting have, including the first game, which is that they can be a bit too easy, especially for experienced players, but I think they usually do that because when you get a racing game like this, the majority of players probably aren't coming for the drifting, so you make it a bit easier to not be too hard to skip through for those not that invested in it. While here, it might take a good few attempts even for more experienced players because of the physics and revamped points system. Oh, and speaking of the progression, they completely revamped that too, and in my opinion, not exactly for the better. See, the theme of this game in a lot of areas is streamlining, making things simpler and more straightforward, with my best guess as to why being so that they could attract a wider audience of players, but I don't really see how that would help in Grid's case. This means the detailed teammate and sponsor system? gone, replaced with a much less impactful sponsor system that's season-based instead of race-based, and no second driver. The intro, where you race for a few different teams before forming your own, now it's a couple races and test drives before you're dumped straight into the big leagues. The different regions with races and events to showcase the cars and motorsport of that region, now it's just a few championships that show off the different race types, and that's it. You also lose the fully animated and modeled menus, and while I do like the cheap PC monitor and later full-on projector aesthetic of the main menus in this game, it definitely lost a bit of its character when coming from the original. This is also one of the earliest racing games to make you feel like what we would now call an influencer. Sorry, that makes me a little sick in my mouth saying that. And what I mean is, instead of progressing through the game based on a reputation or license system, you now progress via championship wins and the number of fans you have. In between seasons, you start seeing your races posted on YouTube and eventually being covered live on ESPN, which actually is a really cool way to do this kind of thing. But in a gameplay sense, it has almost no impact on how the progression is structured. Still cool though. This also introduced a few new game modes and features, like overtake events, which gave me shades of the original Project Gotham Racing back on the first Xbox, or shifting track layouts, both of which are really fun in concept, but kind of falter in execution. Like, the overtake events are done in a way that means you're not scored on total overtakes, but instead on chaining them together quickly, which is like,
Okay.
And the shifting layouts are neat, but because it's not split-second actively changing the layout in front of you, and it still often repeats major parts of the track, it usually doesn't feel that different from a standard circuit race or point-to-point at the same location. And that's kinda it when it comes to what this game does different, which is a little underwhelming because of the gap in release between this and the first Grid game. But honestly, I still really enjoyed this game, despite what a lot of my friends told me to expect. Now, do I think it's better than the original? To be frank, no. But if I were to rate the original Grid at a solid, let's say 8.5 to 9 out of 10, I would still put this at a solid 7 to 7.5. Not an all-time classic, but still a really fun game that I would understand someone saying was their favorite, even if I think the original was better. It's on that same rung as putting Carbon or Pro Street as your favorite Need for Speed, like I do, despite Hot Pursuit 2 and Most Wanted being stronger and more focused overall experiences. There's just something about this game that people often enjoy, and I get that, but to a lot of other people, this was seen as a low point in the series' then 15-year history, and the bashing on this game actually got so strong that it warranted a response from Codemasters. And their response was... And this was definitely one way to respond. Grid Autosport is the textbook definition of a course correction. Like with cars, in all but a few areas, this game effectively tries to do the opposite of whatever was tried or focused on in Grid 2, and that becomes apparent the moment you boot up the game. Unlike both Grid 1 and 2, this game features a relatively barren menu and UI with simple black and white backgrounds and panning shots of cars in an empty black void. While this design was a departure from what the Grid series was known for, it was more in line with what Codemasters was doing with the F1 games at the time, so I guess it did tie them together a bit design-wise. Only problem being, that was also when Cody's had released their worst F1 game to date, so it's not exactly a good sign. Getting into the game, you'll find very quickly that it didn't follow in 2's pseudo break-to-drift arcade handling, instead panning hard left into Simcade territory, feeling much closer to a Gran Turismo, or at the very least a Need for Speed Shift than any of the Grid games had previously. The handling both simulates the weight of these cars, giving them the momentum to really chuck them through corners or feel the differences in track elevation and banking, but while also giving you a little extra grip to make mistakes with. And my favorite in this particular flavor of Simcade Racer, giving you strong enough brakes and grippy front tires as to not have a feeling of understeer going into most corners. I'm looking at you, Forza. It's for sure a departure from where the grid games started with their handling, but not one that I'm inherently opposed to, as I've always enjoyed more realistic track racers that still feature solid aesthetics and progressions, unlike a lot of quote-unquote true sims. And for the most part, Autosport does deliver on that, although with a few catches. See, the main progression is broken up into 5 distinct disciplines: touring, endurance, open wheel, tuner, and street. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory if you're familiar with broad racing categories, although if, like me, you were confused what the difference between tuner and street was, tuner is street-legal sports cars and tune variants competing in actual racetracks in races, time attacks, and drift events, and street races are sports cars and grand tours all the way up to hypercars competing in races on street circuits and point-to-points. As someone with a wide taste in motorsport, I did find this enjoyable, but I also picked up on something that, in my opinion, could push off casual players more than the increased realism of the cars already did. And that is that I think basically every one of these categories comes with a catch. For touring cars, not only are these the slowest of the 5 categories to start with, but they also feel the slowest and most sluggish as you progress through them. This is also where the AI is best suited, as they don't handle lighter machines all that well. So for a beginner player, the category that is first in the list, i.e. the one they're most likely to pick, might be a bit much for them. In the early hours, it also features a 2-race system where the grid from the first race is determined by a qualifying session, and the second is a reverse order of the finishing order of the first. This, while accurate to the real BTCC regulations, is definitely a departure from what someone unfamiliar with touring cars, or really just outside of the UK, like me, would be familiar with. It's not a bad system at all, it's just not one that's explained all that well and did take some time getting used to, although it did actually help with one of the other issues I had with this game. Endurance is a similar case, although this time it might actually push away the more hardcore fans more. Because for an endurance event, 8 minutes and not a single tire or fuel change makes this feel like it promised more than it could deliver. It's less an endurance event and more if that one tire management program from the F1 games was a race instead. Although I did like this class because of how the car is handled. Open wheel is actually one I enjoyed all around because the lighter the car is, the more this handling model shines in my opinion, although the AI would certainly disagree with me. They oftentimes struggle to stay competitive in this class, especially compared to stuff like the touring cars. Tuner was the one I actually started liking the most, as the time attack events in the nimble S2Ks and RX-7s made this really fun, and the return of fan favorite tracks like Okutama gave me glimpses back to what I remembered enjoying most from Grid 1. Only to have those fond memories crater back to earth when presented with the game's drift events. Now in concept, the drift events are fine, as the handling model was drastically improved in these from 2, but for some reason they decided to have this weird new point system that didn't get a proper explanation. I can only assume that, like the other modes, it's loosely based on the regulations of competition drifting like Formula Drift or the D1 GP, but this mode seems to want fast, wide, close, and continuous drifts at seemingly random spots. Although I will give it this, it did actually feel like it scaled properly with the difficulty I put on, unlike a lot of arcade racers when I choose a drift event. And lastly is Street, where I also started off enjoying it, but I realized very quickly that they didn't put enough time to properly test these. Not because it feels bad to drive here, but because it feels bad to race here. See, the thing about this game, and to a certain extent every Codemasters racing game, is that the AI opponents have never been smart. Like at all. Their usual strategy is to brake about 8 miles before they have to in order to give you ample passing opportunities, although it usually just leads to slamming dead into them, and yet still being able to turn accelerate out of the corner faster despite their awful lines. They also like to occupy as much of the track as possible, which would be fine if they had the situational awareness of a real person. Which they don't. And that's what makes categories like Street a handful, is that these CPU opponents that need a large open track to race cleanly in are now being funneled into these narrow street circuits. You see the problem with that? After you've competed in all the different race types, you then get to compete in the Grid Championship itself, which at first I thought would bring me back to more of the mixed race championship feel from the original Grid, but it actually made me realize something. Grid Autosport isn't a Grid game. It's Codemasters using Grid to cosplay as Forza. This was something I actually started feeling in some amount from the moment I booted up the game. From the barren UI and atmosphere when compared to the last two Grid games, to that same UI, I swear being them copying the homework right off Forza Motorsport 5's paper. Both games also feature very similar focuses for their progressions and with taking elements from real car culture and media, Top Gear for Forza and race broadcast for Autosport, to enhance their credibility and reach more real-life car enthusiasts. And to Cody's credit, I do actually prefer this to Forza Motorsport 5 from the same time, mainly due to the more dynamic progression and handling that doesn't have that trademark Forza understeer, but this also can't rely on the same strengths that Forza can, like its massive amount of content or in-depth customization. But this also doesn't feel like a Grid game because the racing, the aesthetic, and even in some ways the career are far too removed from what Grid was in the first two games. And even though people often compare it, I wouldn't say just being more focused on real-life racetracks and disciplines makes it a return to Toka form. Want to know what makes this different from a Toka experience? In the Toka games, you can just feel how much fun they were having making these games, especially in places like the overall look and feel, and the cutscenes, which feel like a goofy reprieve from the more competitive races. This, on the other hand, didn't feel like they had as much time to have fun with it, and they quite literally didn't. This was made in just 13 months after Grid 2. That's nothing. Even keeping in mind they reused a lot of assets both from Grid 2 and the other games they worked on around the same time. They barely had time to make real fundamental changes from Grid 2, and you can feel the potential for some really cool stuff with the direction they were going in. Giving proper tire wear to the Grid games, setup tuning, basically tripling the number of real-life racetracks from Grid 2. Like, they brought back the cockpit camera that was missing from Grid 2, but they didn't have time to make proper interiors, so it looks about as good as when you mod GT4 cars into having interior view. And they included a unique form of dual monitor support, where the second monitor serves as a race broadcast screen. I didn't really experience that last one much, but the rest of those show a bit of what this game was going for and what it could have been if it was just given more time. And keeping in mind that I actually did have a good time with this, I actually rank it higher than 2 in my personal ranking. That's only because I appreciate the Simcade playstyle more, but as a Grid, the next in a line of fun, gritty arcade track racers with light realistic elements, this fails in that regard. And after coming off 2 back-to-back dips in form to many of its fans, Codemasters decided to put Grid on ice again for a bit while focusing on things like making a great rally sim, expanding the F1 franchise, and going completely broke. See, Codemasters was in a bit of a rough patch in the years after Autosport, not directly because of it, but because of the general state of the company. F1 2014 and 2015 were overall disappointments for their series. What had become of the Colin McRae name hadn't had a main entry in over 5 years, and while Rally was a success, it wasn't enough to completely revitalize the company. Cody's was not in a good way at this time, as you can see from their actions like buying and mostly dismantling what was left of Evolution Studios, you know, the MotorStorm and Drive Club guys, and going public in mid-2018 because they were short on funds, despite effectively buying a whole-ass studio not 2 years earlier. So in around 2017 or 2018, work on the next Race Driver Grid game began, which actually got people excited when it was announced in mid-2019, because after Grids 2 and Autosport, the community was left kinda divided. Both of those games were so strong in some areas yet so weak in others that it effectively split the community in two for a lot of areas, mainly over whether or not Grid should be more like a sim racer or more like an accessible, fun arcade racer? And Cody's answer? No. I mean, okay, Grid 2019 is still very much an arcade racer, but in a lot of ways, it lacks the strengths of both an arcade racer and those of a more sim-focused track racer. Like, let's start with the intro to the game. It does that thing common to both other grid games and most arcade racers of the last 15 years. I'd say mainly because of Forza, although Need for Speed was arguably the earliest pioneer of this, and that's if the game has a progression built around rising up the ranks to faster and better cars, then you start the game by giving the player a taste of that upper echelon of performance so they have a goal to work towards in getting back to and eventually surpassing that level of performance. Grid 2019 does this by throwing you in a handful of different disciplines all at the start, from sporty GTs to stock cars to modern touring cars. And like, look at this. Let me ask you something. How fast do you think I'm going? 100, 130 miles an hour? Like, here's what a stock car around Indianapolis looks like in Forza Motorsport 4, a game which is 8 years older than 2019 and was made in a 2-year cycle after Motorsport 3. I'm going at a pretty decent clip here of about 180, 190 miles an hour. So with that as reference, how fast do you think this is? Wrong answer, it's over 200 miles an hour. That's one of the first major problems I had with this game. There's no sense of speed. Or actually no, that wouldn't be telling the whole truth. There are times when I did feel like I was going fast in this game. Not during braking, accelerating, or hitting top speed like I would with any other racing game of this type, but on a couple tracks in the time attack class, the cars felt both agile and barely controllable enough to convince my brain that I was actually moving with some amount of pace. Although this was one of very few times that actually happened in the game, and this problem became significantly worse in the older and lumpier feeling cars, which are already harder than usual when it comes to judging things like braking and throttle control. That's not my only problem with mid-2019 though, because unlike the first two Grid games, this game lacks a lot of the style and character which made the originals stand out in this genre, now leaving us with more generic sounds and music, and a UI and animation style that is saturated MMO-like at best, mobile game-like at worst. And you use that underwhelming UI to navigate an equally underwhelming campaign, which just feels like a bunch of different event types slapped together with no particular logic or meaning to them, only that, in general, they get faster as you progress through them. It also feels like such a slog too, because I dumped nearly 20 hours into this for the video, and yet I still feel like I barely got into it. But it also doesn't have nearly the same variety that the last few games did, now just having races, sprints, time attacks, and time trials, also known as races with and without laps and time attack with and without laps. So in effect, you have two game modes in this game. There's no toge, no drifting, no speed challenge, no point score, nothing to make this any different from any other track racer of its day. Now does that mean I think this game is bad? So, in an objective sense, although that's not a thing in a personal review, 2019 is a fine game. It's got all the basic features and enough cars and tracks for me to call it an adequate track racer. I know right now there's probably someone in the comments who's played this and actually really enjoyed it, and I respect that, that's fine, but this is just not a good grid game. And I learned part of the reason this is the case is because of the game's development. One of the major contributors to that troubled development was that this would be a Google Stadia launch title. Been a minute since you heard that name, hasn't it? They even included an exclusive mode in the Google Stadia version where you could race against a grid of 40 cars. Holy shit!
Motherfucker, are you out of your damn mind?
The AI are barely competent enough for a field half that size. Who thought it would be a good idea to add more to that? They also tried to say that this mode was only possible due to Google Stadia. But either way, Stadia sucked for 99% of people and died after less than 4 years, so this version is basically lost media now, and a similar story goes for the base version of the game too, because barely over 4 years after being released, the game was delisted from all major platforms, and is now only available through sailing the seas or spending a couple bucks on gray market keys like I did. Which is a bit unfortunate, although I'm not that sad about the game being gone from most platforms, primarily because of this. Grid Legends is basically just the answer to, what if the new Grid reboot was good actually? And in a lot of ways, this served as a return to form for the series, but in equally as many, it felt like too little, too late. From the outset, it looks just like an iteration on what mid-2019 was trying to do, with a lot of the same cars, tracks, event types, car classes, UI elements, and graphics appearing in both games. However, just beneath the surface, this game actually shows a lot of promise. First and foremost being the return of actually feeling how fast you're going in the game, which was missing in 2019, and depending on who you ask, could have been lacking since Grid 2. This combined with the physics changes to both make the cars a lot grippier coming out of corners, but also increasing the focus on weight transfer and keeping up your momentum in corners, made this a much more engaging game to drive in than 2019. This was also the first, and by the looks of it, only Grid game I managed to play the online for. When I started working on this video, Grid 1, 2, and Autosport had long had their servers shuttered, and by the time you're watching this, 2019 will have followed suit. And only with a month's notice, damn. But yeah, this was the only one I got to race with friends in, and to be honest, it was generally a good time, although how the lobby system actually worked confused me for a second, but I eventually figured it out. This was fun to run a few laps with, and I got into a good session with fellow racing game video maker Gamer Alex, but I think this was less because of the game's systems making it easy or intuitive to get good racing out of, and more the fact that I was playing it with someone who was generally trying to have good racing with me. Because that's something I noticed people mention a good bit with the online in games like this, is that it's good because I had fun with my friends on it. You want to know what other games are fun with friends? All of them. You can enjoy the literal most dog shit game ever made, but if you're in a call with the homies, that's gonna be some of the most fun shit you're ever gonna play for all of 2 hours. Why do you think friend slop is a term some people actually use to describe a game where 90% of the fun is dicking around with a bunch of idiots until something cool or interesting happens? And in that regard, Grid Legends is a fine example, just not an exceptional one. Now, when it comes to the core single-player experience, this is probably the closest the series got to returning to the style of Grid 1, but also, with so much of 2019 still in here, it's hard to call it a true return to form. The game gives you a few different options for a career mode, either a linear, team-focused mode where you build up your team through a series of races and eventually beat the reigning champions from Raven West, or the more freeform mode where you get to pick a discipline and move up the ranks with various cars, unlocking and upgrading them to use for later. These are cool concepts, but to me they suffer from not being one long, detailed career and splintering the ideas off between the modes. Like, let's take the story mode. This one actually reminds me the most of Toka Race Driver 2 from 2004, both in terms of how it's structured and the return of story cutscenes in between races. Although, like Toka 2, there's a significant disconnect between what actually happens in the story and what happens out on track. But unlike Toka 2, this game was playing it too safe to not have even the dumb moments like that game did, leaving this fairly rudimentary story about rising up the ranks as a little bit of a letdown. But the Grid games aren't really story focused anyway, so were the races at least fun? Yes, but they didn't give me any super memorable or challenging moments for the vast majority of the game. I was able to blitz by most of the opponents, but there were some notable and, I don't think, fully intentional exceptions to that. See, one of the bigger problems I had with this game directly stems from its rushed production, which are the bugs and the design that could easily be confused for bugs. Like, let's take the time attack events for an example. When I was first playing through some of the non-story career mode, I noticed how in a couple events, the AI would just randomly gain 2 to 4 seconds worth of lap time on me, only in the final lap, and would never show this pace during the actual event itself. This was bullshit, and broke both my immersion and enjoyment with the game during these events. which basically forced me to put it down a difficulty level despite obviously being fast enough to beat just about anything the game threw at me. On the same, nearly as egregious end of the coin, we have what happened to me and Alex during our first time attack in a session, where we had a relatively slow outlap because we were still getting used to the cars, and then we both overcooked it a little on our second laps. No big deal, right? Just go back around and they didn't count our third lap. What the fuck? So as it turns out, Grid Legends, along with a good few other sim or track-focused racers with a timed lap system, decided one of the elements they wanted to take from real-life track racing in order to make their games more realistic was to make it so going off track in a lap not only invalidates that lap, which makes sense, but also invalidates the lap afterwards, even if you are nowhere near the start-finish line, meaning this gives you no actual advantage.
I mean, that's like hanging a guy for shoplifting.
There are a good few games that get this right, like Race Room, LMU, and weirdly enough Forza Horizon, but for some reason Forza Motorsport, Gran Turismo, Project Cars, and Automobilista 2 don't seem to have this quite right. And in Legends, they have this system combined with a lot of the time attack events only being 3 laps long, meaning that if you invalidate one of them, you're likely to lose 2/3 of your chances at getting a clean lap, forcing a restart. Why this isn't pointed out or patched out is beyond me, but that's not the only area that's like this. There's minor stuff like body panels randomly flying off cars, the camera clipping into the floor in certain scenarios, as well as the wheels of some opponent cars. But then there's the problem that doesn't start with this game, but certainly wasn't fixed in it. The AI drivers. Okay, so the CPU opponents in these games have never been all that great, but that wasn't as big a problem in the PS1 and early PS2 days. But with the narrower tracks and the larger number of cars on track and the improvements to overall NPC behavior, the AI drivers are now facing a much harder challenge that they were never properly designed for. I started to notice this all the way back in Toka Race Driver 3 when some classes that the AI wasn't equipped to handle caused me to get shunted off track who knows how many times, leading to hours of restarting. This is also because outside of Grid 2019 of all games and about half the events in Autosport, none of the Grid games have any sort of qualifying. So you can't really circumvent the fact that this game is basically always going to start you near the back of the grid of a bunch of cars that can't drive. So in essence, the game either becomes NASCAR circa 2022 or NASCAR circa 1992. And the worst feeling is when you know you're faster than the field, but you just cannot pass no matter what. That's why in the Grid Autosport and Legends sections especially, I had to cut out a lot of crashes, simply because it wasn't worth showing me having to restart races 20 times over. And like I said, this isn't a problem exclusive to Legends, but it is one that still impacts it, and one that you'd think would have been noticeably improved over the years, but it just wasn't meant to be. Altogether, these games are still part of one of the most storied names in racing, but if sales or the poll I put out in the community tab are anything to go by, it's very heavily lopsided towards the early days. And I think I agree with that. My ranking for the series is probably Race Driver Grid, a noticeable gap, Autosport, Legends, 2, and then another wide gap until we get to 2019. Which is the only grid game that I can say is antithetical to what the grid games are, and that's being boring. Then again, there is only so much you can do with one style of track racing, and as much as I love Cody's original tracks like San Francisco, Havana, and Okutama, it would be nice to try something a little different, like say, maybe something on dirt? After a 3-year-long hiatus from the Colin McRae rally name, they finally made their 7th gen debut with a game that seemed like a spin-off, but much like Race Driver before and Grid after it, would eventually replace and eclipse the original series in both sales and acclaim. No, not that acclaim. Although an important note for this time is that soon after the initial release, Colin McRae, the namesake of the franchise and a legend in the World Rally Championship, passed away in a helicopter crash with 3 other passengers, including his son. He was just 39 years old. The impact of his passing was felt across the racing world, including by many at Codemasters, who had gotten to know Colin when him and his team offered their expertise to help improve the games. Some even got test drives with him and attested to both his driving prowess and genuine nature when talking to him. But before we got hit with one of the greatest tragedies of the late 2000s racing world, we got a last hurrah from the series that shared his name. Colin McRae Dirt was a much smoother and more direct transition between what Colin McRae Rally was and what Dirt would be, more so than I think even with Toka and Grid, even though this was actually released a year before Grid 1. Like the Colin McRae games, this was still primarily focused on rally and rallycross, although instead of including a few cars outside of those categories more as gimmicks rather than dedicated classes, this time they're put front and center with their own unique classes like hill climb, buggies, core trucks, 2 different classes of rally raid, and even hill climb big rigs. You ain't never seen a Freightliner move this fast. These new classes add a lot of variety to the gameplay, giving it a similar feel to Toka 3 in that respect, although the actual campaign structure itself is a lot closer to its predecessor in CMR 2005. With a similar kind of event tree, just this time laid out as a pyramid and no longer having the test events that I actually kind of liked from the last 2 rally games. Now as a side note, since this is one of the only times I'm going back and basically redoing an entire review section, I want to try not to repeat myself too much, but I also want to expand on the parts of the games that I didn't get around to talking about the first time. Like in Dirt's 1 case, the audio. Actually, I wonder if DJ Arcus has anything on Dirt 1's audio since he did work on it. This is from an audio test done about half a year before the game's release, when they had just figured out the collision audio for the game, and we're trying to do some testing to get a feel for how it would operate in-game. And also dick around in a physics sandbox with smashing sounds, which I 100% get. The audio in this game is definitely a step up from where it was in the Colin McRae Rally games, although they were still getting used to some of the new technology, with this being both the first CMR game made for 7th gen consoles and being the first to use the Neon engine, later known as the Ego engine, which Cody's continues to use revisions of to this day. While the game might sound good, outside of the weirdly loud intro track with disturbing moaning in the background, the visuals of the game haven't aged nearly as gracefully. The piss filter and bloom era was in full effect at this time, and unfortunately, Dirt 1 is a prime example of that, making some tracks hard to even make out properly with the amount of effects layered on, and others just looking a bit too dark and muddy. I'm not going to say there's no part of the game that looks good, and the menus and UI elements do a decent job at tying the warm and desaturated color palette together in a fairly satisfying way, but like I alluded to in the Grid 1 section, that game does a much better job at actually utilizing this sort of aesthetic without appearing nearly as washed out. Speaking of the menus, they actually show a direct continuation of the style from the last 2 Colin McRae games, that I find really satisfying as someone who's now got to experience that history, and that also extends to the campaign, but with a few new additions. The overall structure takes a lot from CMR 2005, but instead of the performance tests and one-off events found throughout the campaign, instead you have modes that aren't directly tied to rally racing, but off-road racing in general, hence the name change. Some saw this as an abandoning of the core focus of the series, especially with it still being named after one of the most famous rally drivers of all time, but honestly, if there was any way to spice up a gameplay formula which was on its 6th iteration at this point, this is probably the best way to do it while still keeping a strong grounding in Rally. And the main career mode is structured much like Grid 1's in that you basically have to try every mode at least once, but are never locked into only playing one. So if you like Rally, Rallycross, and Baja trucks, but not core buggies and big rigs, you can choose to skip those events, and the game will still progress as usual. Speaking of the cars, the handling for each of the classes was done actually really well, giving each class a unique feeling while not making any of them so distinct as to feel like a completely different experience. And they even saved some of the more difficult classes like Group B, Big Rigs, and Hill Climb monsters for later in the progression when you're more likely to have a handle on, well, the handling. Although I will give the caveat here of the physics still feeling a little too much like their 6th gen counterparts in how floaty and sometimes unresponsive the cars can feel at times. Granted, it's not nearly as bad as say CMR 3 or how the rear-wheel drive cars in 2004 were, just that compared to where it would go in the series, it's just off. On a personal note, I think part of the reason I don't click as much with Dirt 1 as I might want to is because of when I played it. I had the games that would follow, Dirt 2 and 3, for several years before getting this, I think roughly in 2014. And honestly, I'd say knowing what would come from this series later kinda soured me on this game. Because I remember not really liking it that much at the time, and not being able to handle the floatier feeling in the cars nearly as well as something like Dirt 3. But this game has actually grown on me a good bit since then, and while still not my favorite, this is one I would absolutely recommend to a fan of the series, just maybe not as a first impression. For my first impression, and still to this day favorite of the series,
this time,
well,
we're gonna get funky. Funky. Everybody clap your hands. Right foot stop, real smooth. Clap your hands. Left foot stop, real smooth. Wrist roll, hop real smooth. Right foot stop, real smooth. Wrist roll, hop real smooth. Left foot stop, real smooth. All right now, cha-cha, real smooth. Clap your hands. Wrist roll, hop real smooth. Clap your hands. Cha-cha, real smooth. Clap your hands. Wrist roll, hop real smooth. Clap your hands. Clap your hands. Freeze!
Dirt 2. Man, this game is good. From the moment you boot up this game, the change in vibe is instantly apparent. With the passing of Colin, they needed a new focus for the games when it comes to motorsport appeal and style, and if they could have picked anyone in 2009, they went with about the best option for a racing game. Ken Block. Ken, who had only recently started rallying at the time, might have seemed like an odd choice, but with his ties to the Rallycross and especially X Games worlds, he, alongside multi-time X Games gold winner and Rally America champion Travis Pastrana, effectively served as the twin leads for the series going into Dirt 2, as they both narrate and feature heavily throughout the game. Speaking of Ken...
Let me tell you about Ken Block, rest his soul. He was a lovely bloke. He was very, very nice. I worked with him quite a lot on Dirt 2. So he did, no, it wasn't Alpine Stars. What was the company he had? Damn it.
DC Shoes?
DC Shoes. So he owned DC Shoes. He sold DC Shoes and then got people to pay him to advertise DC Shoes on his cars.
I made a whole documentary about him. I know like all of his stuff.
Well, I bet if I don't tell you 2 facts you don't know, I'll eat my hat. So,
okay.
He had been in a lot of car accidents and had broken a lot of bones. So he could not deliver a full line of speech. So in Dirt 2, he's in it, and we had all his lines recorded, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't say, "Hi, I'm Ken Block, and welcome to the Gymkhana Racing, and here we are in Montreal, blah, blah." He would go, "Hi, I'm Ken Block." So he couldn't hold a breath in because he broke his ribs so many times, so he would have to do it in short little bits. So that's why Travis Pastrana, who is a radio TV personality, he did nearly all of the lines. So Ken Block could not deliver a whole line of dialogue. So that's why he's barely in it, unfortunately. So he just hurt himself too much. Did you know that one?
I don't think I knew that one, but that's more, I know that's more to do with like Dirt 2's development than with him, because a lot of the stuff around that era, I wasn't able to find good information on. Oh, and actually, since we're still technically talking about the intro,
I said I had an Impreza. We recorded the Impreza. So if you watch the Dirt 2 intro, when Ken Block's car comes in, does the loop and drive off, that was me and Mark. He, for the bit spinning around, what happens, I sat there in the car block and revved the engine, and he's found the boom mic. For the bit where it drives up, he went into a lay-by, and I drove into the lay-by at 60 miles an hour and slammed on the brakes and skidded to a halt just in front of him. And then for the takeoff, best moment of my life, this is, I booted it out of a gravel lay-by with him crouched down behind me, shielding his eyes and holding a boom mic. Oh. So, absolutely showered in gravel and dust. And it sounds great. It sounds so good, so good. And then the game comes out, and I swear within 10 minutes of going out, and goes, "How come in the intro sequence for Dirt 2 you have got the classic flat 4 Impreza engine, because everybody knows that Ken Block uses a custom inline-6 engine?" And I got to be the one to reply, and I go, "I'm the lead audio," and I go, "I can tell you why." I go, "Because no one told us. This is news to us. Absolutely no one does. So that's why Ken Block's Impreza at the beginning of the Dirt 2 intro has my flat 4 Impreza engine playing on it.
It's my car, Pillock." I find this incredibly funny, because this is the kind of thing I would point out in one of my reviews as a one-off joke, but also, if anyone says like, "Oh, the important element to a quarter of the game that you talked about isn't important," if the sound the car makes in the intro can be important to a reviewer from almost 20 years ago, then the UI design and music can be important to me. Although I'm going to hold on to those for later. Like I said earlier, this game was a more dramatic shift than the first Dirt game because of the change in tone and approach. Like, I'm going to be honest, calling this a rally game is probably being a bit generous. Yes, the game has rally in it from the very start, but I wouldn't call it the primary focus of the game because of how much time it shares with stuff like Rallycross, Raid, Trailblazer, and Land Rush. Basically every other notable discipline of off-road racing. They even went and removed the normal championship mode, which Dirt 1 still featured. I assume because, like me, most people didn't play it their first few times because of how much better the full career mode was. And while that was a bit of a loss, the career mode we did get in Dirt 2 was absolutely amazing. The thing about rallying and most off-road racing is that unless it's confined to a certain location like the Baja 1000 or the Rally Monte Carlo, most of these series are very international events. And while that was very apparent on track in the previous Colin McRae games, some of them, like Dirt 1, didn't do the greatest job at distinguishing those locations, and the ubiquitous color palette of gold and brown didn't help either. So here, the campaign is laid out as a full map of the world, with all the countries you visit being marked down with a series of events to compete in, unlocking new locations and events as you progress. It's a simple layout, but shockingly effective, and it does a good job at pacing the game's main progression. Another knock against the game from longtime fans of the series and rally diehards is the removal of a lot of classic and historical cars from the sport. Like now, instead of a category for classic rally cars, retro 90s legends, and Group B monsters, there's just one or two cars representing them in the larger rally and rallycross classes. They don't even feature some manufacturers at all, like Lancia, Audi, or Peugeot, who've been mainstays of rally for decades. While I do understand these complaints, I don't think it's something that fundamentally makes the experience of this game worse, not because I don't want to see those cars in these games, but because I think Dirt 2 was trying to put the focus more on the modern cars. Because to be honest, rallying wasn't doing so hot in the late 2000s.
Rallying wasn't such a cool thing then, so that's why we moved onto the Gymkhana stuff, the festival stuff. I said I genuinely apologised to my mate at the weekend for the new Ubisoft crew game, and for Horizon, because I said we pushed that, we invented it, but the concept of having car racing games set at a festival, that was us. We're so sorry. It's been done to death. Force has done it God knows how many times. The crew's copying it. It kind of started in Grid 2, not Grid 2, in Dirt 2, bit more in Grid, but we were having to appeal to a younger audience, because even in its height of rallying, it was an old man's sport. It wasn't like a young cool kids thing, and we had to appeal to the younger generation and get them into rallying, because we had to make them care. And unfortunately, all the old school rally people, they didn't like the festival stuff, but the younger generation, as Forza kind of proved, very much did.
Many of the most iconic manufacturers in the sport's history had either left or were in the process of leaving as the games were being developed and released. Those names I mentioned before, they all left the sport years before the game released, and even the names that had defined the sport during Colin's peak from the mid-90s to the early 2000s in Toyota, Mitsubishi, and Subaru had left by 2009. That year, the WRC featured a grand total of 2 factory teams. Yeah, 2. Contrast that with a decade prior in 1999, which had 7 factory entries. And of those 2 factory cars, being the Ford Focus RS and the Citroen C4, neither of them actually appear in the game. Instead, all of the rally cars featured are either the handful of classics I mentioned before, cars from the Production World Rally Championship, or PWRC, which still had the likes of Subaru and Mitsubishi, and the bulk of the rally car list in-game were actually just sports cars and tuners brought up to rally spec, like the BMW Z4, Mitsubishi Eclipse, Nissan 350Z, and Pontiac Solstice. I'd say this was done in one part to fill out the roster more, because having only 2 to 4 cars in the main class would have been more than a bit underwhelming, and so they could appeal more to one of the most historically underdeveloped markets in rallying, the American market. Many of the cars added to the game were ones that were either only sold or primarily marketed towards Americans. And while some might decry it as pandering to a market that has never been that receptive to rallying, if they were looking to get more eyes and car brands into the sport, pushing it more in an environment known for its car culture and consumer spending seems like the right idea to me. Anyway, I've been going on about the real motorsport for a while, so how's the actual game? It's great. In the races, the cars feel both slippery and loose, as they should given the terrain, but also with the perfect balance of weight and grip that makes them feel incredible to chuck through the corners. And even though most of the tracks don't allow you to go above about 120 miles an hour, that difficulty in handling makes these cars feel like they're moving at light speed, because just one little mess up and
just a knock.
If there's one thing this game does well, it's portraying the danger and adrenaline that rally and the motorsports like it can induce. That's always been one of my favorite things about this sport, because as much as I and others might be able to wax lyrical about the fascinating technology of something like F1 or IndyCar, or talk for hours about the storied histories of series like NASCAR or Le Mans, one thing many of these motorsports struggle with outside of the car is in presenting an engaging product to actually watch and be a part of. Sure, I can cherry pick moments, but a lot of the time these races don't immediately draw your attention like they should. There are few moments where rallying comes off as boring, because it always looks like the drivers are on the knife's edge of control, and in that way, Dirt 2 does an amazing job at showcasing that feeling. On the visual front, this game is an absolute masterclass in aesthetics and the power of things like stylized realism, combined with a setting that is absolutely perfect for this kind of game. Because at the same time as rally's decline in popularity, there was a rise in car shows and festivals which started showing up in a lot of games at the time like MotorStorm, Need for Speed Pro Street, and later, probably most famously, Forza Horizon. Here, the festival atmosphere really adds to the sum vibe of the game so effectively that it ranks as one of my favorite styles in any racing game. And that style is aided perfectly by the game's soundtrack. I keep forgetting just how good this game's soundtrack actually is, not because it's bad, but because it doesn't actually feature any music in the races, with the only noise heard being those from the cars and environmental sounds, which is already incredible in this game. Shout out Adam and his team. But the music used in the menus and transitions is just so smooth in its placement and execution, which contrasts with the actual rough and dirty tones in this primarily metal and alt-rock focused set list, along with a sprinkling of electropop and dance music. This music, the way it's used in game, and the diegetic feel you get of leaving your trailer and walking out to have the music open up, is just such a vibe. It's hard to not just feel good playing this game. I would give you some direct examples, but this is YouTube, so I absolutely recommend just playing the game yourself, because it's that good. The game also earns some extra credibility for having an amazing racing soundtrack, because a good handful of the best racing game OSTs of this era also shared songs with this game, which is a nice, if unintentional, touch. Man, looking back on it now, this was really my introduction to rally as a motorsport, and along with the first Grid, were really some of my first motorsport games in general. And while there's almost certainly some nostalgia at play, I can't help but say these games have still aged incredibly today, in just about all ways, big and small. Although unlike Grid, Dirt 2 wouldn't be the last of its series to see near unanimous acclaim. Dirt 3 continues both the hot streak Cody's was on coming onto the 7th generation and the changes that were being made to the series from Dirt 2, and the most obvious of these changes comes from the tone of the game. Remember when I said that Dirt 2 started to focus more on drivers like Travis Pastrana and especially Ken Block for their tone and presentation? Well, Dirt 3 goes all in on that new direction, now even dropping the Colin McRae name entirely. Which honestly, I think makes Dirt 2 a fitting send-off to the name, given that it also featured a heartfelt tribute to the late great if you beat the main campaign. The new changes made affect almost all aspects of the game, but in no way so strong as to separate it from Dirt 2 entirely. Like, let's take the campaign. Structurally, it shares a lot with 2, having varied regions and disciplines for you to race through and stylizing the events with unique sponsors and names that fans of the sport or off-road racing in general are likely to recognize, although with one new major addition, Gymkhana. Thanks to the influence of the X Games and especially Ken Block's Gymkhana series, the once obscure halfway house of autocross and rallycross now was being seen by millions across the world, and Cody's, wanting to keep up with the trends of the day, decided to put a more gamified version of it into their new rally game. Now I'm not gonna lie to you, this part of the game has turned a lot of people off of it, especially in recent years where people go to try out the game for the first time without that context. However, even if I found them a bit challenging to get perfect scores on at first, which you don't actually need to do to progress, I can't lie to you and say that I haven't found these to be amazing when they hit just right. Those, along with the occasional drift event, are the only new additions to the game modes, with Rally, Rallycross, Trailblazer, and Land Rush making up the majority of events. While the layout and UI of the campaign is a little bit of a downgrade, especially stylistically from Dirt 2, I do still think it's a more than serviceable experience for a game like this. It didn't detract too much from the experience, but that is one of the reasons I personally rank 2 higher, although I know opinions vary on this. Where I think this game does match, and maybe even exceeds 2 though, is in the driving. These 2 games are some of the most similar feeling in the franchise, with probably only CMR 4 and 5 being the next and having very similar approaches to handling and track design. One thing I will give 3 is that I think it's a little flatter in how varied the track design is. Like, instead of having tracks as wide and open as Utah, or as closed in as, say, Croatia or Malaysia, a lot of these tracks in 3 feel a lot more single groove. Like they're all about the same width and complexity throughout. Now, I'm not saying that like it's a bad thing, or like 3 has no variance in that regard. Kenya is a bit wider, faster, and arguably easier, while something like Monte Carlo is a lot tighter and more complex. But where Dirt 3 makes up the perceived difference is in the track types. I mentioned how Dirt 2 was a big step up from 1 in terms of having the tracks feel more unique, but Dirt 3 takes that to a whole new level, with every environment from Aspen to Kenya, Monaco to Michigan feeling both unique and fun to drive. I especially like that the Monaco track actually incorporates bits of the F1 circuit into its design, bringing the games more in line with their motorsport-centric roots. And speaking of motorsport heritage, they finally brought back a lot of those classic rally legends that I mentioned were missing from Dirt 2. And even a few I didn't, like the Lancia Fulvia, Alpine A110, Renault 5 Turbo, and Ford Sierra Cosworth. They actually brought in so many rally cars that they didn't just separate modern and classic cars like many CMR games had before, but instead made entire classes for every decade, including breaking the modern classes into the WRC spec and S2000 spec, basically like the junior formula to WRC's F1, and 80s into the Group B class and the earliest parts of the Group A class, although they threw the Opel Manta in there for better balancing. I know I said that it didn't feel like that much of a drag on Dirt 2 not having these cars in the game, but what I think these games really do is tell a story of the motorsport they're trying to represent. Dirt 2 was the present of rallying, wavering, unsure, and having lost much of what made it great, while Dirt 3 is the future that learned from its past, taking the lessons learned and the legacy founded and building upon it, showcasing both the new talent and vibrant stars that would define the sport going forward. Like with any change, there would obviously be pushback, but I think Dirt 3 presents a future for the sport that's hopeful that things will get better. Unfortunately, the same couldn't exactly be said for the series itself. Now, Dirt Showdown didn't kill the Dirt franchise, arguably nothing could have immediately following Dirts 2 and 3, but what it did show was some of the more unique ideas the team had when they weren't shackled to the confines of Rally, but also how those same confines also provided the structure that this game often lacks. The premise behind Showdown is pretty simple. Basically just, what if Dirt 3 was based around Demolition Derby instead of rally racing? Which is a neat idea, but one that I think would be better served by an indie game inspired by Dirt 3, rather than the studio who made 3 taking most of the assets and porting them to a game which is fine in its best moments, but in its worst, just reminds me that I could be playing something better. Now, what this game does bring to the table in its Rampage, Knockout, 8-Ball, and Hard Target modes are all variations on the idea of a Demolition Derby, and while they are fun for the first couple times, they do lose their spark relatively quickly, because of how disconnected the base engine and physics feel from these ideas. Like, this was made for rally racing, not smashing cars into each other. I did generally enjoy my time with these modes, especially the King of the Hill style one, but they just didn't leave the strongest impression, which unfortunately also goes for the races and Gymkhana events. These are basically the same as in 3, with them even sharing a couple track layouts, although I swear they messed with the camera or something in this game, because the sense of speed feels way off compared to 3, and most of the time it feels significantly slower. While I still think this game is a little underrated, most people forget it even exists, I can't put it up there on any pedestal compared to the rest of the series, and thankfully, it didn't take Codemasters long to return to their rallying roots. Dirt Rally was kind of a surprise when it came out in 2015 because Codemasters, who'd been steadily distancing themselves from the real motorsport of rallying, had dropped a full-on racing sim dedicated to the sport, and they did an incredible job with it. At the time, there weren't really many rally sims on the market. There was WRC 5, which had finally come back after Kyloton had gained the rights to the WRC license. Alright, fair enough. There was Richard Burns Rally, a decade-old simulator which only a year and a half prior had got the earliest versions of its next-generation physics plugin, which would eventually make it one of the best and most realistic rally sims, but at this point was still fairly unknown to most racing game fans. And if you want to stretch it, games like BeamNG and Assetto Corsa, which didn't really feature rally as a selling point, but were very moddable and versatile physics and racing simulators that could, in theory, do rally racing, although they wouldn't have all the extra infrastructure that came with that, like cautions, stages, and any sort of championship mode. And this is where Dirt Rally comes in. In essence, Dirt Rally is what happens when you take the approach of the Dirt series, or really the Colin McRae Rally series, and filter it through the age of the modern racing sim, your R-Factors, your project cars, what have you, and it does a great job at it. The physics and track design feel extremely tight and work well together, making the gameplay really engaging, and unlike a lot of the racing sims of its day, it was made with both wheel and controller players in mind. Although that doesn't mean this game is easy for most players, it's still a challenge, but in a very rewarding and engaging way. There's been some debate among sim enthusiasts as to whether or not Dirt Rally, acknowledging that most players don't have the ability to drop a couple hundred on a dedicated controller for these types of games, makes it a true sim. And my answer to that is, who fucking cares? It's a fun video game that makes rallying cool, which is basically all I'd want out of this. One minor gripe I do have with the game is that there isn't really much to do outside of the races. Like, the strong aesthetics from Dirt 2 and 3 are almost entirely gone, but honestly, this more straightforward approach does work for this more straightforward experience. Maybe the menu navigation could be a little smoother, or they could have done more on the presentation side, although like with Grid at the time, this was also in line with Cody's general design language in the mid-2010s. The progression is also a little on the slower side, because I think there's a bit too much time spent in the slowest cars in the game, but overall, the structure of it is quite good. If I were to compare it to any previous game, it'd probably be to the first Dirt, not only because it shares in its simplicity and also in being one of the only games in the series to feature Pikes Peak, shout out Polyphony for finally letting people use the license they refuse to touch, but also in that I think a lot of the best ideas in this first game would eventually be fleshed out even more in its sequel. I feel like every time I play through Dirt 4, my feelings on it change a bit, but my actual rating for the game stays mostly the same. Like, right off the bat, this game looks a lot like Dirt Rally, with more simplistic design and navigation than what a lot of its predecessors had, and so you think this is sort of the more accessible version of that game. Kinda? Dirt 4 actually features two handling models, both of which feel like less dynamic versions of the handling models that came before. Like, the arcade handling model was made with something like Dirt 3 in mind, which is fine, except these tracks weren't made like Dirt 3's tracks were, especially in how narrow and restrictive these tracks can be, but I'll get to more of their problems in a moment. And similarly, the sim handling feels like they took the physics from the first Dirt Rally, loosened them up to make them feel more engaging, and then placed it on the aforementioned tight tracks. And I honestly need to go on a small tangent about the tracks, okay? Alright, so the rally tracks in Dirt 4 are almost entirely generated as you play the game, which sounds cool, right? Oh, infinite possibilities for tracks with each of the unique environments just being a backdrop and a surface type, right? Wrong. What this actually means is that almost none of the rally stages end up having any distinguishing features outside of what environment they're set in, and also there's not that many of them, like there's literally only 5 rally locations in the whole game. The road one, the snow one, the dusty one, the fast gravel one, and the slow gravel one. And that's literally it for the entire game. That lack of real variation makes the game also feel quite repetitive when you really get into it, and while the car categories do a lot to relieve that repetitive feeling, what they can't do is fix the handling issues I mentioned earlier. But it's not like this game doesn't have any cool new ideas. One idea I really like from this game is the more fleshed out team management and sponsor system, which is probably the best version of this implemented into a Cody's game until the My Team mode from the later F1 games, where each of the individual sponsors, team members, and facilities are dependent on you not just for upgrading but also for regular oversight, as both sponsors and team contracts expire after a certain amount of time, so you have to keep checking those areas after every few championships, which I actually really like compared to the grid approach of set it and forget it, but that alone, plus the inclusion of Land Rush back into the series, in its most bare bones form might I add, isn't going to save this game from feeling a bit lackluster for the name it's trying to continue. And while I do usually have fun playing through this game, it's one that almost never crosses my mind when I actually want to sit down and enjoy a rally game. It just doesn't do enough from a sim or arcade racer's point of view to really draw me in. Although, for a game that does have that kind of focused experience, it would only be a couple years before Codemasters would deliver us just that. I'm glad that out of all the racing sims to not just break out of the sim racing niche, but the racing game niche in general, that this is one of them. In a sense, this is what a large number of gamers are likely going to get as their first exposure to the world of Rally, and for that, Dirt Rally 2 does a great job. From my perspective, this is effectively an upgraded Rally 1, which might sound obvious, although there is still a bit of debate on which one of them is actually better between them, with the biggest points in favor of 1 being the inclusion of Pikes Peak and some minor physics changes, and the biggest in favor of 2 being a bit more general content, sans Pikes Peak obviously, and some improvements to the UI and progression. Also, some people prefer Rally 2's physics more. Truthfully, I could go either way in this debate, although I tend to prefer Rally 2 because it's the one I started with, and so I'm a bit more comfortable with it. But there's no real wrong answer here. This is one of the more consistently challenging racing games I've played, not just because of its physics, but also the differences in how each of the cars and classes feels. That and also the opponent times can be a little inconsistent. That is one genuine knock I have against this, and probably also the first Rally in Dirt 4, being that the opponents seem to vary wildly rally to rally in terms of how difficult they are, and also they don't base your rival's stage progress, this thing, on the fastest driver of that stage, but they instead base it on whoever was leading going into that stage. Now, in a realistic sense, that would track with the co-driver not actually knowing how fast the other drivers have gone so far, but in a gameplay sense, it's weird to have that be a specific diegetic element when other things like absolutely smashing a pedestrian aren't. Also, who in their right mind decided the spot they were going to stand to warn drivers of an upcoming accident or mechanical failure should be right at the outside exit of a corner? They do this often in Dirt 4 and Rally 2, and it's annoying in a gameplay sense and even dumber if you think about it logically. Although when I want to simmer down a bit from the high action rallies, I usually go to the frequently updated challenges or to the Rallycross mode, which, contrary to what we've established about Codemasters AI, is probably the more straightforward and easy mode in the game. Not because the AI doesn't still occasionally get in the way, but because the much wider and more consistent tracks and environments take the pressure off of having to navigate the course. Once I've got my line in, it's pretty much smooth sailing to an easy finish for me. Another cool thing is the online leaderboards. These have been a great way to compare with friends, and are what a lot of the community has been based on for the last 7 years since the game's release. And as the true multiplayer options are a little limited, and nowadays there are very few public lobbies, leaderboards have become where much of the community connects and interacts. I'm sure this will be a staple of the game for years to— oh motherfuck! Editing Fastminer here, I actually made a mistake, and after talking with other people in the community enough about it, I learned I wasn't the only one with this misconception, so I'm gonna make this little section here to highlight it and address it. So you may have seen some news recently as of this video going up that suggested the online for Dirt Rally 2 was being shut down in its entirety, and how that would mainly affect online players. This is not actually the case. The thing that's being shut down is the RaceNet clubs specifically, and all the things that were tied to that because of the website being used to host all that stuff being shut down. So stuff like the weekly events and online leaderboards will remain unaffected. For now. This is an unfortunate blow to the people who use that feature often, although and it seems a good chunk of the player base, never really did too much with it, so I don't think I have anything to add to that discussion in my own review. If you want that, watch this video. But getting back to Dirt Rally 2, I think this is still one of my favorite games in the series overall, even with a couple of its issues like not having the best base setups for its cars or locking a surprising amount of content behind paid DLC. It still delivers a worthwhile experience, and one that I think is probably one of the best inroads for someone looking to get into rally racing, alongside another game I'll talk about more later. But before that, we have to get to what I think might just be one of the lowest points in the series' history. Oh, so this is the first game in a while that actually requires some background to fully understand. So, in April 2016, Codemasters bought much of Evolution Studios after Sony had decided to close the studio due to poor sales. Evolution had been going for the last 2 decades, making some of the most interesting but never massively successful titles like the original WRC lineup, MotorStorm, and prior to their closing, Drive Club. This was a studio which spent their time presenting new and interesting ideas for the genre, and which had the potential to do great things moving forward. After the buyout, they started working on their next project, which was 2018's Onrush, released under the new name of Codemasters Evo. Onrush is interesting because this game actually shares a lot in common with the best games from Evo, both in terms of gameplay and their mindset on how to make things the fucking awesome. But 2 things. 1, I actually don't know how good it is because it was only released on consoles and I don't physically have a copy. And 2, it absolutely flopped. It flopped so hard that within a month, large parts of the team were let go, including several key leadership members. They were then handed the license to make a game for one of Codemasters' most important series at that point, and what they came up with was this. This is not really a dirt game, despite it being called Dirt 5, but this also isn't really a MotorStorm or Drive Club like either. In a basic sense, this feels like what happens if you started with the race feel of something like MotorStorm, floaty, open, off-road racing that works best in a dynamic but still very player-controlled environment, but then you told the people making it, hey, can you make it feel like the Horizon Festival except even more oversaturated, and also figure out a way to tie it into our series of rally games? Good luck! And with that background, I understand why Dirt 5 is the way it is, but that doesn't make it any less painful to play. First of all, there's no rally in the rally games. No, I'm being serious. There's rally cars sorted into several different rally categories. There's time trial events, but only in massive off-roaders and buggies. There are just no rally stages or events in the whole game. Really, this is just the lineup from Dirt 3, except now they split Rallycross in 2 based on whether or not it's on ice. They added a special rock climbing event, and they threw in sprint cars for some reason. This sounds like it would make the gameplay more varied, and it does, at the cost of focus and nuance. Because now, without Rally being the grounding that all the other game modes are based on, the handling feels like it doesn't account for all of these race types, leaving it feeling floaty and disconnected, almost in a similar fashion to the lowest points from the original Colin McRae Rally run. There are a couple new ideas here, like a level editor, or for some reason having a section entirely for Donut Media podcasts. Not really sure how that ties into the game, but they're undercut by just how weak that base is. And like a lot of modern arcade racers, you'd think you'd just come back with the multiplayer and have a good time there, but no. Because during its early release, the online barely functioned. And since then, the servers have been so dead that even when I first covered the game 2.5 years after release, I couldn't get a single lobby together. So you already know I can't now. This game literally is outperformed by both Dirt 3 and Rally 1 on Steam for player numbers, which is almost comically sad. Because this seems like this would have made a decent multiplayer game, but I'll never know because I never experienced it publicly, and very few people I know are willing to pay $60 for something this blatantly mid. And I mean, look, if you enjoyed Dirt 5, that's fair. The game runs and looks well enough and is diverse enough in its content to where I could see someone without that much background in the genre or series enjoying it, and I'm not about to hold that against them. But almost nothing this game does is novel or new, and a lot of what it does has been done better both by other developers and by many of the people behind this exact game. And that wouldn't even be the worst thing to come out of Codemasters around this time, because literally at the same time as Dirt 5 was being released, Codemasters was actually looking to be bought out by Take-Two Interactive. Bet you didn't see that coming. Who are the parent company behind studios like Rockstar and 2K, which Codemasters would be operating under. The initial offering came in at around £740 million, or $950 million, with their final offer being just shy of $1 billion. But then at the last moment, Electronic Arts stepped in and offered a bid of roughly $1.2 billion, to which Take-Two then rescinded their offer, leaving EA as the sole owners of the studio. I wonder how that's been for the studio on the 5 years since. Not great. But before we got a series of layoffs and the pawning off of the EVO team to Criterion, let's take one last look at the final Codemasters games before they were relegated to just making F1 games and occasionally helping with other EA projects. EA Sports WRC is a game that really gets to me, not because it's a bad game, quite the opposite in my opinion, but because the mistakes this game makes are ones that both Codemasters and their parent company EA have made over and over and over again. The problems with EA WRC are nothing new for a game like it, but I'd rather talk about what makes the game good first. This is the first officially licensed WRC game made under Codemasters since technically Colin McRae Rally 3 over 20 years prior. And for the years leading up to it, the WRC license had primarily been handled by Kyloton, also known as KT Racing, who would also have access to the test drive name around this same time. And we all saw how well that went. And with Cody's history in the sport, it made sense that they would be able to appropriately handle the official license. And I think in terms of representing the sport, they did a damn good job at it. Both from the car and track list, so much of this game covers the vast history of the series, even with more obscure cars like the original Ford Puma, Hillman Avenger, Talbot Sunbeam, and Vauxhall Nova. And this game also has a new signature feature for the sport, letting you develop your own rally car. This aspect of the game, as well as a lot of the team management and specialization mechanics, feel to me like they were inspired by Codemasters' own F1 games, and I feel like if they were going to add anything to the baseline formula of games like Dirt Rally 2, this would be the move. The progression and season mechanics are probably my favorite aspect of the game off track, and honestly, this is what made me start enjoying the game more as I continued to play it. Getting into the actual races, this is where some contention for the game comes from, especially from more sim-focused fans, because that Rally 2 comparison wasn't made for no reason. The WRC game we got was originally planned to be Dirt Rally 3, and EA's takeover and the new license are seemingly the reason why that didn't happen. Now, if I thought about this purely as a Dirt Rally game, this would actually come a little short in terms of living up to the bar of games like Dirt Rally 2, especially in the challenge and focus on the in-the-moment feel of rally stages. But if I wanted something more true to the actual sport, EA WRC arguably does that better. To me, they both have their strengths and weaknesses, and neither takes a massive win over the other. It's just more a matter of personal preference. Granted, I'm not factoring in stuff like wheel support, which may be different between the two. I wouldn't know because I only drove WRC with a controller, where the game sits surprisingly well. Like Dirt Rally, it was made with both wheel and pad in mind, and seems to have struck that balance that would make it appeal to as many players on both as possible. The only real major gripes I have with this game are some stability and performance issues, like higher presets being surprisingly taxing, or how, regardless of settings, the game suffers from a concerning amount of object popping and weird shadows, all of which were made far worse in the earlier versions of the game I played near launch, and also how a concerning amount of the in-game content, especially in the cars, is locked behind paywalls. Because of course they are. But it's not like you still don't have a lot of content in the base game, especially in that extensive seasonal career mode I mentioned earlier. However, looking at the bigger picture, I feel like this game was almost more the victim of its own expectations and background rather than its own failings. Because with a name as long-running and as directly tied to the sport as Codemasters, a lot of people probably expected a lot more from a game that, to be frank, played a lot of stuff pretty safe, minus the EA fuckery that we have basically come to expect at this point. And that's why I said this feels like a lot of Cody's previous faults coming back to bite them, because the two games this reminds me of most are Dirt 4 and Grid Legends. Grid Legends because this feels like Codemasters going back to their roots, but not in a way that will truly win over fans, both those that started with the series and that are just getting into it, because they played it just a bit too by the book. And Dirt 4 because, from my perspective, this feels more like a Dirt 4 2. This basically takes everything I liked about that game and does it better, and really makes me see this game as a great baseline that Codemasters could build on into the future, growing the franchise with it. But you likely already know that's not what happened, because in the time since this game's release, Codemasters has gone through 2 separate rounds of layoffs and had their support studios surrendered to the Battlefield machine. They lost the WRC license back to Nacon, the parent company of Kyloton, and now have been relegated to only making the F1 games. This is a pretty sad affair for a studio like Codemasters, not just because of the studio's history, but because of all the people I've talked to who have histories with the studio. They all seem to have a strong passion for both racing games and the greater medium as a whole, in a way that I think often goes unnoticed by gamers who just assume no one who works on these games actually plays them. They do, and they almost always have a lot of the same takeaways, positives, and complaints as you or me, because they care about games. I don't know what the future of Codemasters looks like, and I can't say I have high hopes for the studio, especially given the sort of moves their parent company has always made and is still somehow finding ways to get worse. But I think overall, these games show us what happens when pressure, consumer and corporate expectations, and a continually changing landscape of games clash with a dev team that, while not always hitting the mark, at least always felt like they were trying to put something new forward, whether that was a new way to play their games or a new kind of game entirely. They felt innovative in a way that few other studios did. and for that, I have nothing but respect for them. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry this video took so long to make. I had so many issues both in and outside of my control that led to the delays, and now it's finally done, and I'm going to be taking a long break from series reviews after this, and focusing more on single game experiences and other topics, like one you'll probably be seeing on the live channel soon, so stay tuned for that. But before you go, I want to give a massive shout out to Adam for letting me sit down and talk with him. He was super insightful both about his time at Criterion and Codemasters, but also about the gaming industry at large. So thank you for the chat we had, and I'll leave a link to his work in the description below. I also want to give a shout out to my patrons and YouTube members, especially Zelepner, Gaming Light 2000s, Login, and Noah Prescott on the YouTube side, and Lino, Kevin Christian, Solid Chris, Military Snake, Phoenix Q, Devil Bullet, Montego, and Adriatic Atrocities on the Patreon. Thank you, and I'll be seeing you all again, hopefully soon.